Pack up your things and get out of my restaurant right now.
I was only 10 years old when I watched my mother stand in the middle of a crowded restaurant trying not to cry. The owner laughed at her, threw her paycheck onto the floor, and told everyone she wasn't worth respecting. That day, I made a promise to myself. 20 years later, that same man walked into my office asking for help, and he had no idea who I was. Some memories never fade, not because they're happy, but because they leave a mark on your heart that time can never erase. My name is Emily Carter. Today I own one of the fastest-growing hospitality consulting firms in the state. People know me as a successful businesswoman. But very few know why I chose this career. It all began with one afternoon when I was 10 years old. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional family drama, inspiring comeback stories, and unforgettable plot twists, make sure to subscribe. Every story on this channel reminds us that dignity is priceless and kindness is never wasted. Now, let me take you back 20 years. 20 years earlier, the bell above the restaurant door rang as my mother and I stepped inside. It wasn't a fancy place, just a busy neighborhood diner where she had worked for nearly 6 years. My mother, Sarah, was the hardest working person I'd ever known. She worked double shifts, skipped meals, wore the same shoes until they nearly fell apart. Every dollar she earned went toward rent, school supplies, and keeping food on our tiny kitchen table. That afternoon, she smiled at me. "Sit over there, sweetheart. I'll only be a few minutes." I nodded and picked a small booth near the window. I opened my homework notebook while waiting. Everything seemed normal, until the restaurant owner arrived. His name was Richard Hayes. He was known for his expensive suits and his cheap treatment of employees. He walked straight toward my mother without even saying hello. "Sarah." His voice echoed across the restaurant. "Come to my office." She quietly followed him. The office door stayed slightly open. I couldn't hear everything, but I could hear enough. A few minutes later, their voices became louder. Then suddenly, Richard stormed out holding an envelope. Every customer turned to look. My mother followed behind him. She looked frightened. Richard didn't care. He raised his voice so the entire restaurant could hear. "If you can't keep up with the job, maybe you don't deserve one." My mother's face turned pale. "I've never missed a shift." "I only asked about the overtime you promised," Richard laughed. "Overtime? You should be grateful I even let you work here." The room became silent. People looked down at their plates. No one said a word. Then, Richard threw the envelope onto the floor. It landed right in front of my mother. "Her paycheck, pick it up. If you want your money, earn it." My mother stood perfectly still. For a second, I thought she might cry. Instead, she slowly bent down, picked up the envelope, brushed the dust from it, and whispered, "Thank you." That broke my heart. I jumped out of my chair. "Mom!" She immediately looked at me. Her eyes widened. She hadn't realized I had seen everything. She rushed toward me and forced a smile. "It's okay, sweetheart." But it wasn't okay. Not even close. As we walked toward the door, Richard called after us. "You'll never find another job paying this much." My mother didn't answer. She simply held my hand tighter. Outside, we sat together at a bus stop. She finally opened the envelope. Her smile disappeared. "They cut my pay," she whispered. "They didn't even pay me for last week's overtime." I looked at her tiny hands. They were covered in burns from years of carrying hot plates. All that hard work, and this was how she was treated. I leaned against her shoulder. "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to own places like that." She smiled sadly. "No, Emily, you don't need revenge." I looked into her eyes. "What do I need?" She gently wiped away my tears. "You need to become someone who never treats people the way he treated us today." I nodded, but deep inside, I made a different promise. One day, Richard Hayes would remember my face. He just wouldn't recognize it until it was too late. End of scene 1. Cliffhanger. 20 years later, Emily is now the CEO of a successful hospitality consulting company. One rainy Monday morning, her assistant walks into the office holding a business card and says, "Ms. Carter, there's a restaurant owner here asking for an emergency meeting. He says his business is about to collapse." Emily glances at the card. Her heartbeat stops. The name on it reads, Richard Hayes. The name on the business card made my heart stop. Richard Hayes. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. 20 years disappeared in an instant. I wasn't sitting in my executive office anymore. I was 10 years old again, watching my mother pick her paycheck off a dirty restaurant floor. My assistant, Megan, looked at me. Ms. Carter, are you okay? I slowly placed the card on my desk. How long has he been waiting? About 15 minutes. Should I tell him to come back another day? I looked through the glass wall of my office. A man in his 60s sat in the reception area. His expensive suits were gone. His shoulders were bent. His hair had turned gray. He looked nothing like the confident businessman I remembered, but I recognized him immediately. Richard Hayes. I took a deep breath. Send him in. A few moments later, the office door opened. Richard walked inside carrying a worn leather folder. He smiled politely. Ms. Carter. Thank you for seeing me. I stood and shook his hand. It's nice to meet you. He had no idea who I was. Not even a hint. I invited him to sit. So, what can I do for you? Richard sighed heavily. My restaurant chain is failing. We've lost customers. Our online reviews are terrible. 3 locations have already closed. I've heard you're the best hospitality consultant in the state. I need your help. I listened quietly. The irony was almost unbelievable. 20 years ago, my mother had begged him for fairness. Today, he was asking me for mercy. I opened the file he had brought. Financial reports, employee turnover, customer complaints. Every page revealed the same problem. Poor management. Low staff morale. Dozens of employees had resigned within a year. I looked up. Richard, can I ask you something? He nodded. Of course, when employees leave your company. Why do you think they quit? He laughed awkwardly. Younger people don't like hard work anymore. They expect too much. His answer told me everything. Even after 20 years, he hadn't changed. I closed the folder. I'd like to visit your main restaurant before making any recommendations. Relief spread across his face. You'll do that. Absolutely. When? Tomorrow morning, he smiled for the first time. Thank you. As he stood to leave, he paused. You remind me of someone. I smiled politely. Really? He nodded. I just can't remember who. After he left, I sat alone for several minutes. Memories flooded back. The restaurant, my mother's tears, that promise at the bus stop. I quietly whispered, You still don't remember us. The next morning, I arrived at Richard's flagship restaurant. The building had been renovated, new signs, modern furniture, expensive decorations. But within 5 minutes, I realized the biggest problem hadn't changed. The employees looked exhausted. No one smiled. Customers waited far too long. A young waitress accidentally dropped a tray. The dining room fell silent. Richard immediately shouted from across the room. What are you doing? That's coming out of your paycheck. The waitress looked terrified. She couldn't have been older than 19. She apologized over and over. Richard didn't stop. If you can't do this job, I'll find someone who can. My hands tightened. It was happening again. The same humiliation, the same fear, just a different generation. I walked over calmly. Richard, he turned toward me. What? I looked at the young waitress. Would you give us a moment? She nodded gratefully and hurried away. Then I looked back at Richard. Do you always speak to your staff like that? He shrugged. Fear keeps people working. I stared at him. No. It makes good people leave. He laughed. That's the difference between business school and real life. I didn't argue. Instead, I spent the rest of the day observing. By closing time, I had learned everything I needed to know. The kitchen staff avoided Richard. Managers were afraid to make decisions. Customers complained that employees seemed unhappy. The restaurant wasn't failing because of the food. It was failing because of the culture. That evening, Richard met me in his office. So, can you save my business? I placed a thick report on his desk. I can, hope filled his eyes. Really? Yes, but only if you're willing to make one change. Anything. I looked directly into his eyes. You need to apologize, he frowned. To who? Every employee you've ever humiliated. He laughed loudly. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. His smile disappeared. I'm not apologizing. They work for me. I slowly stood up. Then my work here is finished. He looked shocked. You're walking away. I picked up my briefcase. No. I'm walking away from a problem that refuses to admit it exists. As I reached the office door, Richard called out. Wait. I stopped. Without turning around, he asked quietly, Why does this feel so personal to you? For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I slowly turned back. There were tears in my eyes, but my voice remained calm. You once told a single mother to pick her paycheck off the floor. Richard's face went pale. His hands froze. He whispered, "No." I took one step closer. I was the little girl sitting by the window. The folder slipped from Richard's hands. Papers scattered across the floor. For the first time in 20 years, the man who had humiliated my mother had finally remembered my face. The room became completely silent. Richard Hayes stared at me as if he had seen a ghost. His face lost all color. His hands trembled. "The little girl," he whispered. "You?" I nodded. "Yes, the little girl who watched her mother pick up her paycheck from the floor." Richard slowly sat back down. For the first time, the confident businessman I remembered was gone. Only an old man filled with regret remained. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I've thought about that day more times than I can count." I looked at him. "Really?" He lowered his head. "I didn't know you were there," I answered quietly. "That didn't change what happened," he nodded. "No, it didn't." Richard walked toward the office window. He looked outside at the nearly empty parking lot. "You know, I used to believe fear made people work harder. I thought kindness was weakness. My father ran his business that way, so I copied him." He sighed deeply. "I never realized I was destroying everything." I folded my arms. "You didn't just destroy a business. You destroyed people's dignity." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." He turned back toward me. "How is your mother?" For a moment. I smiled. "She's alive. And she's finally happy." Richard closed his eyes in relief. "I've wanted to apologize for years." I looked surprised. "You remembered her?" He nodded slowly. "Not her name, but her face." I remembered the way she looked at her daughter. I remembered the disappointment in her eyes. He paused. "I just never had the courage to find her." I quietly sat across from him. "You know what the strange part is?" Richard looked at me. "My mother never hated you." He frowned. "She didn't?" I shook my head. Every time I talked about revenge, she told me the same thing. I smiled through my tears. "Don't become the person who hurt us." Richard looked down at the floor. She was a better person than I ever deserved. I reached into my briefcase. Richard looked confused. I placed a photograph on his desk. It was an old picture of my mother, smiling, standing in front of the small bakery she had opened after leaving his restaurant. Richard picked it up carefully. "She opened her own business?" I nodded proudly. "With money she saved for years. It wasn't big, but every employee who worked there was treated with respect." Richard smiled sadly. "She succeeded. Without becoming like me." Just then, my phone rang. It was my mother. I answered. "Hi, Mom," she laughed. "How's your meeting?" I looked at Richard, then quietly answered, "It's almost finished." She smiled through the phone. "Remember, be kind." I laughed softly. "I know." After hanging up, I looked back at Richard. "My mother doesn't even know I'm meeting you today." Richard whispered, "Maybe that's for the best." I stood up. "So here's my decision." Richard slowly looked up. "I'll help save your restaurant." His eyes widened. "You will?" I nodded. "But under 3 conditions." "I'm listening." "First, you personally apologize to every employee, in front of everyone." Richard nodded immediately. "I will." "Second, every worker who had illegal pay deducted gets reimbursed." He nodded again. "Done." "And third," I looked him directly in the eyes, "you spend 1 day every month working beside your employees. No office, no title, no special treatment. You serve customers, you wash dishes. You understand what leadership actually means." Richard smiled for the first time. I deserved that. 3 months later, everything had changed. Richard kept every promise. The public apology was recorded. Many employees cried. Some forgave him immediately, others needed time. Richard accepted both. The restaurant slowly regained its reputation, not because the food improved, but because the people finally smiled again. Customers noticed. Business returned. One afternoon, Richard visited my office again. This time, he wasn't asking for help. He handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" He smiled. "A donation." I opened it. Inside was a check made out to a scholarship fund. The name at the top read, "The Sarah Carter Scholarship." Richard quietly said, "No child should ever have to watch their parent lose their dignity. I can't erase the past, but maybe I can help create a better future." Tears filled my eyes. I looked toward the window for a moment. I imagined my mother smiling, not because justice had won, but because kindness finally had. Epilogue: a few weeks later, my mother and I visited her old neighborhood. We walked past the building where that restaurant had once stood. She squeezed my hand. You kept your promise. I smiled. Not exactly. She looked at me. I wanted revenge, but you taught me something better. She smiled. What was that? I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Success means nothing if you forget how people deserve to be treated. She kissed my forehead, just like she did when I was 10 years old. And in that moment, I realized something. The greatest victory isn't making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. The greatest victory is proving they never had the power to change the person you were meant to become. The end.